So I recently learned about native popover support in HTML. And when I first heard about this, I was excited because we use popovers all of the time for toast notifications. Sometimes we'll display a search box that people can search in, and then we'll display just a short list of search results, all in a popover. But the most common use is just displaying a user saying, hey, we're doing something, please be patient. Like whenever we fetch something from the server, we might want to display some kind of message. That's perfect for a popover. But unfortunately, it leaves a lot to be desired, which is something that we will talk about here in a moment, because the actual use of native popovers is actually very limited. But we'll get into that. First of all, let's create a popover. So let's create a div. Let's give it an ID of popover message. And then let's have a message for the popover, just so that we can have something to see. Now, by itself, this is just a normal div element, but we can turn this into a popover by just applying the popover attribute. And that's it. That's all we have to do to create a native popover. So we're done. No, not really. But of course, we need to be able to control this popover. Now, we can control it in a couple of different ways. We can use JavaScript, which we will obviously talk about, but we can also use just plain ordinary HTML. So let's look at the HTML approach, and then we'll dive into the JavaScript API. So to control a popover, we need a button. And unfortunately, it has to be a button. It can't be any other kind of element. Our popover can be any element, but the controlling element has to be a button. And let's do this. I have a class of button primary. That way we can easily see the button on the screen. And then we have an attribute called popover target. And we set this to the ID of the popover that we want to control. And for the most part, that's it. Let's give this a text of open popover so that whenever we view this in the browser, we have our open popover button. We click on it and there's our popover. We can click on the button again and the popover goes away. So there's a few things to talk about here with our popover. First of all, it is a popover. If you think of the page as a bunch of different layers, the popover is at the very top layer. So it is on top of everything, making it a popover. That has some implications, because if it's on top of everything, what happens if you want to display another popover? It just gets placed on top of the existing popover. So whenever you show a popover, it is always going to show at the top layer. So it's always going to be on top. So you can think of a popover as having a Z index of the highest value possible. The other thing is that whenever you create a popover by using the popover attribute, it essentially makes that element display none, which is basically what we would want, because when the popover is not displayed, we don't want it to mess up anything as far as the document flow. So that's good. Whenever the popover is displayed, then the display property is set to block. So when it is shown, it is block. When it is hidden, display is none. Now, third, we have two different states of popovers. We have what is called auto state, AUTO for automatic. Then we have manual state. Now, the default is auto state. And whenever you use the popover attribute and you don't assign a value, or if you assign the value of auto, then you have a popover that is in auto state. And it has very specific functionality, especially when it comes to dismissing the popover, because it uses what's called light dismiss. That's just the terminology that the documentation refers to. So in order to light dismiss a popover, we can do so by clicking on the button that controls the popover. You can see we can toggle that on and off. We can dismiss the button by pressing the escape key. We can also dismiss the popover by just clicking anywhere else on the page. Now, with that functionality, there are also implications. If we have a popover in auto state, that typically means we can only have one popover in auto state active at one time, because if we open up another popover in auto state, it's going to close the current one that is open. Now, there is a caveat here. You can have nested popovers. In fact, if we go to the examples that are on MDN, there is a nested popover menu example to where whenever we click on this button, it will show the menu. This is a popover. Whenever we hover over pizza, then this other popover shows. Both of these popovers are in auto state, meaning that we can dismiss them by pressing the escape key, or we could just click anywhere else on the page. Now, I personally don't think that is a very good use case of popovers, just because of the amount of work that goes into making that work. So yes, it's possible. No, I don't think you should do it. You do what you want, however. Now, when it comes to controlling a popover, we can have as many elements as we want. There are no hard and fast rules. So let's do this. I'm going to create a container for multiple buttons. And we'll start off by making these buttons be able to completely control these elements. And then we will limit what they can and can't do. So we'll have our first button, open popover. We'll have a second button called open popover, but let's give this a secondary styling just so that we can see them differently on the screen. So here we have our two buttons. We can control this same popover with both of these buttons. So there's nothing that says you can only have one element. You can have as many as you need, but it doesn't really make sense for us to have two buttons that both show and hide the popover. So what we could do then is add another attribute called popover target action. And then we could set this to one of two values. We can have open, and then we can set the other to close. In which case, we now have two buttons that do very specific things for our popover. The open button simply opens the popover. It will not. Okay, I lied. Let me make sure I typed this right. Popover target action open. It's not open. It's show. So let's change the terminology here. We have show. We don't have close. We have hide. So let's make sure we use the right terminology here. Okay, so now we can go back. We have two buttons. If we click on the show popover button, we can only show that popover with that button. So I'm clicking this multiple times. It's not closing. Similarly, the hide popover button can only hide that popover. So it does not show it. It simply hides it. Now, this popover can be light dismissed. So we can still press the escape key to hide it. We can still click anywhere else on the page to hide that. However, what about manual state? So let's change this. Let's set the popover attribute on our popover to manual. Well, for the most part, it's going to be the same functionality, except that we are now manually controlling the popover. So we control when it shows, we control when it hides. It cannot be light dismissed anymore. We have to explicitly hide that popover. So those are the differences between the two states. We have auto, which allows us to light dismiss the popover. Then we have manual, which requires us to manually control the opening and closing. I shouldn't use those terms. The showing and the hiding of those popovers. So now let's talk about styling because yeah, we need to style this. And the most common way to do that is to just use the popover attribute selector so that you can apply the same styling to all popovers. Now, of course, you might not want to do that. You might want to have different popovers for different purposes, but at least you can set a base set of styling by taking this approach. So let's do this. Let's give it a width of 100%. Let's say max width is going to be 20 rem. Let's also give it a padding of 1 rem. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay, that's better, but let's have a border radius of, let's say 0.5 rem, and then let's set the background color. I don't want it white. Instead, I want it kind of grayish. So let's do 65, 65, 65. That is going to look okay. The text, though, needs to not be black. So let's set the color to something lighter. I don't want it just bright white. So let's do something like 243, 244, and 246. That should be bright enough that we can see it, at least as far as the contrast is concerned, but that didn't work. And, you know, it helps if you use the correct. There we go. Okay, so RGB. Okay, that looks a lot better. And that's really it. I mean, we could keep going further on this, but I think that this is going to be fine. We could, though, add a title. So let's do that. Let's have a div. We'll use flex, justify, between, because we might want to have multiple things in the title or the header of our popover. And then let's give it some margin at the bottom. For our title, let's have a span. Once again, we'll have some margin at the bottom. The text size, medium. Let's say the font will be semi-bold. And then the color is going to be white, just so that it stands out. So now we can have our title. Let's just call this popover title for the time being. So let's take a look at that. That's great. And if we wanted a button to close the popover, we could easily do that. Let's give it just a lowercase x. And then all we need to do is set the popover target and popover target action attributes on this button. And that will give us the ability to close that popover directly inside of that popover, just like that. I like that. Now, of course, not every popover is going to need that functionality, but for right now, that's going to work fine. So we can show the popover and then we can hide it in a couple of different ways. And I like that. Now, let's keep working with our style because popovers have a backdrop and we can style that by using the backdrop pseudo class. We can say backdrop filter, and let's give this a blur of 3 pixels. That might be a little bit too much, but we should at least be able to see that filter. And sure enough, that's very blurry. Now, there's one thing about this backdrop, and that is, notice we can interact with the things behind the backdrop. So if I wanted to hide this popover by clicking on the hide popover button, we can do that. Now, this is different than dialogue. Whenever you show a dialogue, the backdrop prevents you from interacting with anything behind the dialogue. Popovers, not so much. You can interact with anything behind the popover. So from a functional standpoint, there's really not much of a reason to use the popover because it doesn't prevent the user from interacting with anything. But from a visual standpoint, it could help bring the popover forward so that the user definitely notices that popover. But, again, that's going to be based upon a use case. So you can use the backdrop if you want, or you cannot. There is no functional reason to use the backdrop. But we're going to leave that there. And then finally, let's add some animation. So the popover requires a few steps to set up the animation because it relies upon the display CSS property to show and hide that popover. So the first thing that we're going to set is the opacity to 0 on our popover. That's not necessarily required, but I want the popover to fade in and fade out. So that's what I'm going to animate here. But then we also need to set the opacity to 1 whenever the popover is open. And to do that, we have another pseudo class called popover open, to where we can set the opacity at 1. Now, of course, that in and of itself isn't going to do anything. We need to set our transition. So after we set the opacity to 0, let's have our transition. And we are going to transition several things. First of all, we're going to transition the opacity at 0.7 seconds. But that's not enough. We also need to transition the overlay, which we can do for 0.7 seconds. And we also need to transition display, which once again we'll use 0.7 seconds. But that too really isn't enough because we need to allow discrete for the overlay and the display. But then we also have to set the starting style rule. So after our popover settings, after our popover open settings, then we will use the starting style rule. And here we will say that our popover open is going to start with opacity of 0. So quite a few steps to animate the popover. And it's because of the display, because display isn't typically something that we can transition. So there are multiple steps that we have to go through to make this work. So with that in place, we should be able to go and click on show popover, and that fades in. And it also fades out, which is great, except I want that to be a little faster. So let's do 0.5 seconds. And okay, yeah, I like that a lot better. Now we can simplify our transition here because we're essentially doing everything here at 0.5 seconds. So we could just do something like this, all 0.5 seconds, allow discrete. And this is going to give us the same end result. So let's just comment that out just so that we have that there. But if we go back, there we go. We have our popover fading in and then fading out. Okay, so now we can control our popover with HTML. We can style and animate our popover. Now we just need to control our popover with JavaScript. And we'll start with just vanilla JavaScript. So let's have a function called show, and we will need to retrieve our popover element. So we have that ID, so we can say document get element by ID, or if you wanted to use query selector, you could do that. And then to show the popover, we just call the show popover method. And to hide it, we'll just create another function to where we will change the name of the function to hide, and the method we call is hide popover. Very simple. So now that we have these JavaScript functions, we can use them on our controlling elements. So that means we can get rid of the pop over target and pop over target action. That's a mouthful to say. So that we can just handle the click event and call show for our show button. For our hide button, we will just call hide. And then we can use that hide function down here for our button that we use to close the popover itself. So there we go. And so now with JavaScript, we can control our popover and everything works just like it did before. Now, remember that this particular popover is in manual state, but we can put it into auto state and everything is going to work mostly the same. I say mostly because there is that distinction between auto and manual. For a popover in auto state, we can now light dismiss this popover by just clicking anywhere on the page or pressing the escape key. However, we can still use JavaScript to hide that popover. So it really just depends upon what your use case is. And now that we are controlling our popover with JavaScript, we aren't bound to using buttons for our controlling elements anymore. So if we wanted to change our buttons to divs, we could do that. I have no idea what this is going to look like, but now that we have divs, well, I expected something to be different. Let's make sure that these are divs. And yes, they are. So even though these are divs, we can still control our popover. We can show it, we can hide it. Everything works like it did before because we are now using JavaScript to control our popover. Now, if we wanted to get a little fancy and just automatically hide the popover after a certain timeout, we can do that. Let's first of all comment out our close button that is inside of the popover, because if we are going to make this automatically close, there's no sense in having a button that allows us to close that popover. And I guess the same would be true for our button that hides the popover. We won't need that, so we can comment that out. And all we really need to do is this. Whenever we show our popover, we'll set a timeout so that we will call the hide function after a certain amount of time, let's say 2 seconds. So now whenever we show the popover, it will display, and then 2 seconds later, it should go away. And that's perfect. It's very easy. It is a very simple API, but let's complicate it. Let's make a view component. So probably the first thing that I would do is not use an ID here because everything is going to be controlled through JavaScript. It just kind of makes sense to set a ref. So let's just have our ref set to popover, which means that we will need to import ref from view. Then we will have our popover that we can get access to. So that inside of our show and our hide functions, instead of calling document get element by ID, we will just say popover value and then show the popover. We will do the same thing inside of the hide function. So that should be the same functionality. Let's check it, make sure, yes. So we're good there. But let's start to extract this stuff out. So inside of my components folder, I'm going to create a new folder called popover, and we'll just call this popover.view. And we're just going to lift the stuff out of the example and put it inside of this component. So basically this entire div with the popover set to manual, the ref set to popover, everything here, we're just going to take out, we're going to place inside of our template. Let's also go ahead and lift out all of the code because we don't necessarily need, well, we might need ref, we might need that. So let's copy everything, paste it inside of the script. Then let's go back, let's get rid of the show and the hide function. So inside of our template here, we would use our popover component. We will set the ref to popover so that we can still get access to that. And then inside of our click event here, we would say refs popover, and then we would expose this show function. But we of course also need to import popover from, let's see, that was popover.view. So now let's go into our popover component. And we have these functions, but let's do this. Let's say const show equals, then we will create that function. We will do the same thing for the show function. And then we need to expose these so that they can be used outside of this component. So let's define expose, and then we want the show and the hide functions. So as far as the basic functionality is concerned, this should be okay. Let's make sure that we haven't broken anything. Okay, everything is working as it should. But now, of course, we need to make this so that it is usable in a variety of circumstances. Like, for example, I want to be able to supply my own message. So this would be my message. We, of course, need to display that. So inside of the popover component, right where we have our message, let's wrap this with a div, and then we will have our slot. So now whenever we view our popover, we see this would be my message. Okay, so that's good. Let's see, there are a lot of things that we could do. Like, for example, we might not always want the popover to automatically hide. So, we could do something like this to where we would have an auto hide prop that we could set to true. Well, that makes sense to me. So let's go ahead and do that. So we have our popover ref, we have our show, we have our hide. I typically like to define my props close to the top. So we'll define props, and I believe that was auto hide. Let's do this. We'll say that the type is Boolean, and we can set the default to false so that inside of our show method, we can check our auto hide prop. And if it's true, then we will, of course, set that timeout. But, maybe we want to make this so that we could set whatever timeout that we needed. Maybe we don't need auto hide. Maybe we just need timeout, to where the type would be number, the default would be 0. So then if our timeout prop is greater than 0, then we could use that value. So from a practicality standpoint, I think that makes more sense. I mean, we could have an auto hide, then we could also have a timeout, but why not just have one prop to do them both? So we'll say timeout, and let's set this to 2000. So we should see this automatically close after 2 seconds. It does, but we can omit this, and we should see our popover just stay up. And well, it went away. Okay, let's look at popover. If props timeouts greater than 0, that looks fine. Syntax errors. Yeah. That's a problem, syntax errors. Okay, so now this should work. Our popover should stay up, and that's all well and good, but now we need to be able to close that. So then we could do this. We could still have our button here, but we could do like if props timeout is equal to 0, then we want to show this button. We will hide that, and that should work. So let's test this out. Sure enough, that button shows up. We can close it. Great. But let's go back and let's add that timeout back in, just so that we can make sure that our close button does not appear, which great, that is now missing. The only other thing that I think we need to do is our title. And we can approach this in a variety of different ways. We could create a popover title component that we could then use here, because not every popover will need a title. This is also something that would be dependent upon your use case. So we could say popover title, but maybe that's just overcomplicating things, because if we did that, like popover title, then the close button is inside of the title. So either we would need to move the close button out of the title, which that could be something that we do, because really the close button would belong to the pop-up itself. Or we could set up, some kind of event that's emitted that it could be something like this, so that we would have hide, and then we would say refs popover hide. I don't necessarily like that approach, because I would think the popover should be able to control that itself. So let's just give it a shot. I'm going to move this button out of the title, because there's really no need for that to be there. And for the sake of just being quick about this, so I don't have to fumble around, I'm going to use inline style to set the top to, let's say 5 pixels. Right is going to be 5 pixels, but let's use the absolute class to set that absolute, and we'll just see how that's going to look. In fact, I guess we could see that right now. Let's go back. Let's get rid of this timeout so that we can see our button. So we show the popover. Okay, so it needs to go a little bit over to the left. So let's make this right 10 pixels. That's a little bit better. And really, I like that position a lot better than when it was in line with the popover title. So yeah, that's good. But let's do this. Let's make this 15. Okay. So that's good. That way we can dismiss that. That way that is completely separate from the popover title. And that way, yeah, I like it. So that's what we're going to run with. We could, of course, do some things to make that a little bit better, but this is going to give us the ability to get rid of the title so that whenever we show this, our button is still there. That's perfect. And we just need to create that popover title component. So we can paste in that markup for our title. And really, for the most part, we're good here because all we need is our slot. So now, if we go back to our example, our popover does not have a title, but we can close it. So that's fine. But if we want to add a title, then we just have our popover title. This is the title. We, of course, need to import that. So let's import popover title. This way we can add a title whenever we need that title. And so now we have our title, we have our close button, and our message. So this is perfect. Well, no, it's not perfect. There's still some things that I would like to do here, but for the sake of using a popover, this is going to be just fine. But that also makes me think, what are the uses for a popover? Because at the beginning of this Laravel, I said that it leaves some to be desired. Actually, it leaves a lot to be desired. So let me show you why. Let's go back to the browser and let's inspect our popover. So right here, here's our popover because popover is set to manual. And let's go to the computed CSS properties. Let's look at the position. So the position is fixed. Perfect. If we hide the popover, the position is still fixed. If we show it, it's fixed. I would like to set it to relative. Because what I wanted to do was create a little notification section in the lower right-hand corner. It's my right hand. I have no idea what it's going to be for you. But, I could push notifications into this little notification center. And then a notification goes in, I push another notification, and they just kind of start to float up, because notifications would flow up that way. Or at least flow down, some kind of automatic ordering thanks to, relatively positioned elements. I mean, this isn't anything that's hard to do. So let's set the position to relative, okay? So just to prove that this relative position is now for our popover, it is right there. Okay, so let's go back to the computed values. Position is absolute. Okay, so let's make it important because if it doesn't work the first time, it will definitely work by adding important. So we can go back, still absolute. So you can't set a popover with a relative position. I don't know if you can set it with static because I didn't bother to check because I didn't need it static. I needed it to be relative so that I could let the browser control the flow of how those were. So if you plan on showing multiple popovers at the same time, you have to position them yourself. So if you want one up here, you have to position it. Here, you have to position it. Any place other than in the center, you have to position it, which isn't that big of a deal unless if you are working with multiple popovers. Like for example, do I still have that example? Yes. So the MDN examples do have toast popover examples so that you can create, a little notification section. That's great. And then they automatically close after a certain amount of time. That's what I wanted. So if we look at the code to make that work, it's not any more complicated than anything else that we've had to do in the past, but that's more work than I want to do. In fact, we could achieve that little notification section with a lot less code by just allowing the browser to control the flow of those notifications. So to me, the use of popovers is very limited to just showing one popover at a time and in the center. Of course, you can position it however you want. If you want your notifications to appear in the bottom right-hand corner, you could do that. In fact, let's do that right fast. If we go back to where our CSS is, I guess I should put this inside of the popover component. In fact, yeah, let's go ahead and do that. Let's just lift this style out, put it inside of popover. So the first thing we would have to do is basically change our inset to unset. Then we could set the bottom to 5 pixels, the right to 5 pixels. And now it should appear in the lower right-hand corner. And sure enough, it does. But again, this is setting the style for all of our popovers. If you then want to set a popover to appear up here and down here, you've got to manually do that. So in my opinion, using the native popover support is really only useful for when you need to show a single popover at a time. Now that popover can be anything. It can be just a message. It could be displaying something like this in my browser to go to, or to open up a new tab. It wants me to search or enter a URL. This could be a popover. So there are uses, but only if you plan on using one popover at a time. If you want to show multiple popovers, then you'll probably want to take another approach.